So I've worked at University of Derby for the last sort of 7 years, where I do research on career guidance. So actually, a lot of the things that Sean was talking about is the kind of area that I'm normally working in. I'm actually going to talk about something slightly different today. So I think one of the things that I say as context is that this kind of critique that we've built, a number of us who've been working in this area have built over the last kind of, I don't know, 6 or 7 years really, of the way in which government policy kind of decimated what was already quite a fragile career guidance system in England. I think it's actually a story where we've had at least, we've made some kind of real progress, and we've had some at least some kind of impact, because I think through the kind of a combination of lobbying, academic kind of critiques, political pressure and so on, we've seen a policy change, and it's been quite a big policy change. And I've then got involved, and this is where my other job comes in, I've then got involved in the Careers and Enterprise Company, which has been advanced by the government as essentially the solution to these problems with careers advice and guidance. Now, there are kind of certainly limits, and the Careers and Enterprise Company is certainly in quite an early stage, but I think I'm trying at least to be very positive about it, because I think it represents a significant policy shift from a position where we've said, actually careers advice and guidance, as under Michael Gove, is unnecessary, we don't need it at all, to this situation now where we've got quite a high profile policy, which I mean, we're still going to see how the new Education Secretary kind of responds to it all, but certainly under Nicky Morgan was something which the government felt was one of its good things that it could say was a kind of an area that it was making progress in. I've actually brought, I'll pass these round. I've brought a few copies of the annual report of the Careers and Enterprise Company, just so you can kind of see what it's about and the kinds of things that it's doing. But so what it's meant is that personally, it's been quite a big shift for me. So I've kind of gone, it was the kind of poacher turned gamekeeper role, that I've gone from being somebody who my main role was to watch what the government was doing and tell them why it was rubbish, to being somebody who's now kind of actually involved. And I wouldn't exactly say that I'm a policy maker, but I'm kind of certainly involved in the policy making process. And so that's what I'm really going to talk about. It's a particular initiative that's going on at the moment, which is around employer mentoring. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the role some of the research that I've done that hopefully will be helpful to that, really. So let's see if we can get this to work. There we go. Right, so this is my personal perspective I'm going to be talking about, but it relates to work that I've been doing as part of the company. So, I mean, I've just passed the annual report round of the company, but for those of you that don't know, the Careers and Enterprise Company is an employer-led company or agency which is funded currently primarily by the Department for Education. So it's been launched as an initiative by the Department for Education to try and address some of these concerns that people have got around careers work. Now, actually, at the moment, its focus is relatively narrow, in that it was set up not to deal with all issues relating to career guidance, but actually specifically to look at the linkage of education and employment. So bringing employers into schools, getting kids out of schools to do work experience. So that's the remit that it's got, and at the moment it's not going any broader really, although inevitably, as we've heard over this conference really, all of these things are interlinked. So as soon as you start saying, well, how do we do employer talks, and this is what Ellie and Christian were saying yesterday, as soon as you start saying, well, how do we do employer talks effectively, you start saying, well, maybe employer talks are more effective if kids have had some kind of careers education, or maybe employer talks are more effective if they're kind of backed up with some advice and guidance and so on. And that would certainly be the kind of perspective that I take. But so the company is quite narrow, but what they've tried to do is to be evidence-based, and so this is why I suppose they've involved me in the company, is the idea that the programs we do should be have some kind of evidential basis. Okay, so remember him? He's a big figure around here. not too long ago. But so he gave, David Cameron gave a speech while he was Prime Minister where he talked about the importance of mentoring. And what he says is that, you know, lots of people, if you talk to people about success, and this is something you know when you do research, if you do career history, sort of biographies of people, when people talk about their success, they usually can find somebody who's played a kind of mentoring role in their life. And often in their youth, one of the people who switched them onto the thing that they then got interested in. And he said, well, wouldn't it be good if we could kind of make this, if we could do something at a government level that could make this more likely. And this relates, I think, to some research. Now, one of the things that the wider research says is that young people who have access to a mentor, now that's not a kind of provided formal mentoring program mentor, but a mentor, someone outside of their family who gives them some help and advice. Young people who have access to that do a bit better. But the problem with that is that the young people who have access to those kind of mentors tend to come from certain backgrounds. So there's a kind of social pattern to the way in which people access informal mentors. And actually Andrea Sliker was talking this morning about the ways in which independent schools enable that kind of thing, and that's one of the things that we've observed. So David Cameron said, well, wouldn't it be good if we could do something about this? And so then it kind of came down to Careers and Enterprise to think about, well, what was that? And so one of the things that we did was we looked at the kind of ideas that Cameron was talking about was about engagement in schooling. So he wasn't really talking about careers actually at this point. He was saying actually, if you've got a mentor, you need to be, that helps you to remain engaged in school. Because you understand what school, the purpose of school is, you connect, it gives you a sort of rationale for working hard, I suppose, and also some help in doing that, and some kind of resilience when things go badly, is that you've got someone who stands beside you who helps you. So one of the things that we did was we did a piece of research, and this was largely my colleague John Boyce, who is here somewhere, but I worked on it as well, and we said, well, can we work out whether young people are disengaged, and if so, where are they disengaged? And what we did was we built a little model where we took data which was, so we kind of had three bits in our model. So we had data which described risk factors. So what we know is that being disengaged in school, we know this from the literature, being disengaged in school is more likely to affect certain types of young people than others. Basically, poorer young people are more likely. So we looked at things like the indices of multiple deprivation and so on there. And then we said, well, we've got some actual measures that we can use which actually kind of measure, although somewhat imperfectly, measure disengagement. So that's things like exclusions, attendance at school and so on. And then we've got some outcome factors, was our third part of our model, where we said, well, actually, if you're disengaged from school, it's probably a reasonable assumption to think you might be a bit more likely to end up as neat. And it's also a reasonable assumption, and again, based on literature, that has an effect on your attainment. And so we we put all these things into a model, and we ran some data, and basically we then mapped it out. We've mapped it at local authority level, but also at LEP level. And what we found, which wasn't kind of completely surprising given the data that we'd used, was that there was quite a pattern, right? So where kids are disengaged is not just kind of completely random, but actually there's a pattern. And one of the things that was interesting about the model we built that we found quite confirming was actually all of the data that we looked, it kind of ranked in the same way. So so there's something going on here. And what it suggested to us is that there are certain areas of the country where you're more likely to get young people who are disengaged, and if we could then help, and now actually Careers and Enterprise Company is funding mentoring programs actually across the country, but there's a sort of a targeting within that to try and focus on the areas where people are particularly disengaged with school, and this was the mechanism we used to do this. So we then produced a literature review which we looked at the issue of employer mentoring, and so that's kind of primarily what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully that underpins the programme that we've then launched. So this guy's Ernest K. Coulter, who's a kind of one of these early 20th century social reformers, who's always a good source for quotes, tells you that nothing ever changes, but he was the person who in the States, they've got this program, Big Brothers, Big Sisters. I don't know whether it's on The Simpsons from sometimes, so it must be important. So anyway, he founded this, and it's basically a mentoring, a community mentoring and employer mentoring program. And he says, well, there's only one possible way to save that youngster, and that's to have some earnest, true man volunteer to be his big brother, to look after him, help him do right, and make the little chap feel that there's at least one human being in this great city who takes a personal interest in him and who cares whether he lives or dies. And actually, I thought, at the heart of it, that's really what mentoring is still about, I think, and it does some other things as well. Like, it may be that you get a mentor who can help you, like, plan your revision a bit better than you would have done otherwise, or help you deal with a bit of maths homework, or give you a career opportunity. But actually what you're offering people, and particularly people from disadvantaged backgrounds, you're offering them somebody outside their family who cares whether they live or die. And actually, I think that's really where as I've been reading about this, I think I think that is actually the heart of what you're doing. And it's also why it's quite difficult, actually. So we'll look in a sec. So we then kind of came up with a definition of employer mentoring. And what we said is, well, employer mentoring, which is what David Cameron was really talking about, is a sustained relationship between an employer, either an employer or an employee or a self-employed person and a young person. And actually that's quite important, because I think when we talk about, education and employers task force and so on, we talk about employers, I think there's a danger with that we focus on people who are at the top of companies, and actually I think it's important. I think employers have got something quite important to bring to this, but actually what we're talking about most of the time is working people. And actually, often we would be better to use the term workers in terms of what we're bringing in. We're bringing in somebody who has experience of the workplace and can share that with a young person. So we've then got this idea that we have a relationship that focuses on personal and career development, and that employer mentors can then help to engage young people in the school, inspire and motivate them, and provide them with meaningful encounters with the world of work. So that's kind of what we were looking at, and so we've tried to look at stuff that fits into that definition. And there are various why this is important is that mentoring is actually a very kind of loose term, and people use it to mean a lot of different things. And one of the things we do in the paper is go through all the different things that people mean when they're talking about mentoring. So when you're looking at the literature on this, you've got to be careful, because for example, when people are talking about youth work, they often use the term mentoring. But I think is different, because that's a professional relationship between a youth working professional and a young person. Now what they do, they may have certain features in common, and the fact that seems to work is probably confirming for what we're talking about. But we've tried to then do a literature review which looks at just this particular thing of a working adult working with a young person in a school. So what impact does it have? Well, what we found actually is that there is actually a substantial evidence base supporting the role of employer mentoring in schools. And this is, I think it's important, because often when we're working in this area, one of the things that people's kind of gut reaction is to say is, well, there's not very strong evidence here. We don't really know very much. Politicians often say that to you. And actually, with employer mentoring, actually there is I would say quite a strong, we've called it moderate to good, because obviously you can always get things better, but I think there's quite strong. So we pretty much know what employer mentoring does. And the reason why I think we know that is that there's a particular technique that researchers use, which is called the statistical meta-analysis. And a statistical meta-analysis basically means that you take a pot of stuff that people have done, you boil them down using their original numbers, and you work out whether across, say, 10, 20, 50 studies, whether the pattern that's being reported actually holds up. And why this is important is because sometimes you'll get a study which says this was brilliant, but then you look at it, it's only got 7 people in that study. So when you put it into a statistical meta-analysis, what you do is you adjust these things. So the things where they've got large sample sizes, you use that to say, well, that's probably a more robust study than the ones that have got small sample sizes and so on. There's a bit more to it, and as I looked further into statistical meta-analyses, there is inevitably a million different ways to do it. But essentially what you're doing is I think statistical meta-analyses are important because they give us the best summary of the evidence that we can get. So why this is important is that where you've got lots of statistical meta-analyses and they all say basically the same thing, gives you confidence that this actually works. So what the evidence suggests is that mentoring can have a significant and observable impact, and we said, well, particularly on behaviour, which we would also include sort of school engagement and disengagement as being one of the things that we've fitted within there, on attainment, and then also on progression. However, the effect sizes are typically quite small. So, this sometimes it's a bit confusing, because what we're saying is that we definitely know well, we don't definitely know, but we've got a very good idea of what employer mentoring does. And what it does is help people a little bit. It doesn't, if you give people employer mentors, it won't mean that they suddenly get A's in all their GCSEs if they weren't going to do that anyway. It won't suddenly mean they all become, the chair of the Bank of England if they weren't going to do that anyway. What it will mean is they do a little bit better than they otherwise would have done. So that's kind of the thing. But that's okay, because what we're doing here is moderate to low cost. Right? So there are other things that you can do, which if you look at kind of the Education Endowment Fund, they rank quite a lot of educational initiatives. And some things that you could say, well, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say something like the provision of teaching assistants. Right, so actually there's quite a lot of debate about how much difference do teaching assistants do. But if we say, well, maybe teaching assistants make a small amount of difference, but that's quite an expensive intervention, because you're putting a person who you have to pay wages and so on in every classroom. So the point here is that this is a small makes a small difference, but one that we can sort of rely on. However, there are some quite big challenges with it, and I've sort of divided these up into three categories. So the first one is employer challenges. Basically, it's difficult to get employers to mentor young people, because it takes quite a lot of time. And that's one of the things that we found, is actually mentoring, it has to be reasonably high quality, so you're asking quite a lot from people. And the second thing is, it's difficult to work with schools, because if you say, well, we want to do something for a year, a school year is actually nothing like an actual year. And then a school year is disrupted by all sorts of things. So you have exams in May, and you have a week when people go on a trip and so on. And so it disrupts the mentoring. So there's a whole set of challenges that are difficult when you're doing mentoring in terms of working with schools. And then the other thing is that mentoring relationships are ultimately relationships between two people. And it's quite difficult to get relationships to work generally amongst all of us. And so there's no reason why, just because you put an adult and a young person together, they're just going to get on swimmingly. So, we then have got some ways that we sort of try and manage and mitigate these things. Okay, yeah. So ultimately what the evidence says is that if you want mentoring to work, you have to do it well. That's not a surprise, but it is important, because it's actually something, because of those kind of challenges I've just talked about, it's actually something that is quite easy not to do well. So what I've then done is, using the literature, I've then built a little model of what I think what quality means when you're talking about mentoring. So the first thing I would say is that mentoring needs to have a programmatic design. Mentoring is not just putting a young person and an adult together. You need to have thought about how they're going to be introduced. You need to have thought about what is it that they're going to talk about. Not to say they can't talk about something else, but you need to give them stuff to do, and you need to think about how it links into all the other stuff that they're doing. So it needs to be designed. It's a piece of learning that needs to be designed. It needs a pedagogy that goes in it. And the employer, and when you put the employer and the young people together, you give them stuff to do that's meaningful to do, that helps them to actually have this mentoring relationship. And that's the important thing, and that's the way that you try and overcome some of these relationship difficulties. Because you're not just saying, do you get on? You're saying, actually, in the first week, why don't you talk about how school's been going for you so far? And then maybe in the second week, you talk about, what are your aspirations for the next 6 months? And then you talk about maybe what do you want to do in the long term. So you give people stuff to do. But the second thing is recruitment and screening. You need a process by which you work out the young people and the adults who are the best people to participate in this. You need some kind of process where you recruit them, you find out whether they actually want to do it, whether they understand what they're doing. You match them and so on. Well, that's then the third thing, is then to match them appropriately. So actually the evidence is a bit mixed about how important it is to have what we sometimes call a relatable mentor, so someone who's basically like you. And broadly, it seems a good idea that if you've got, as we have sometimes with alumni, if you can say, well, look, actually, I sat in that chair, I sat behind that desk, and I felt the way you feel. That's probably helpful. But actually, it seems that overall, it's more important to have a mentor who cares and stays with you and so on than it is to have a mentor, a really relatable one. So there's some studies which say, does it make a difference on gender? Does it make a difference on race? And so on. A lot of this literature comes from the States. And I think the answer is, well, yes, it does a bit, but that's probably not the main thing. So we need to kind of give people stuff to do. We need to recruit them carefully, make sure they really want to do this. We need to match them carefully, and then we need to sort of orient them and train them and explain what this is going to be, how's it going to work, what you can do, what you can't do, and so on. And that needs to happen for both the mentee and the mentor. But it's probably more important actually for the mentor to understand that. And then there needs to be some kind of support and supervision. So whether it's schools or whether it's mentoring organisations, someone needs to check, is this actually happening? If it isn't happening, to chase it up, to deal with problems as they come in, to be somebody, a voice on the end of the telephone, or someone you can meet and say, look, I've been working with my mentor, I just can't get him to talk every week. What do I do? And have somebody who's got some experience who can help you. And then finally, you need to have thought through the end of the relationship. And this is quite important, really, is that the end of the relationship is difficult. Because one of the things that we found is that the length of time that a mentoring relationship goes on is really quite important. It needs to, we think, last probably about a year at least. And in fact, the evidence seems to suggest the longer it lasts, the better. So, and if it lasts, certainly some studies have found if it lasts less than about 6 months, it actually can potentially do some harm. But what certainly seems to be the case is that if you have a mentoring relationship which lasts a lot shorter than you thought it was going to last, then that is a bad thing, and there are some negative effects that people have picked up. Because basically young people feel, you've given me this adult who's supposed to care about me, who's supposed to care whether I live or die, and they've let me down just like everyone else has let me down, and so that can actually be quite a detrimental thing. So what we've tried to do with this is then to come up with a sort of fairly practical set of things that you can say, well, this is what describes a quality mentoring process. Not to say that nothing else is kind of good quality, and there's no other features. I mean, there's for example, one of the things, the feedback we got when we were talking to some mentoring organisations about this was, well, it'd be good if we had a bit more on group mentoring and we had a bit more on online mentoring. And the problem is that when you're doing this literature review type methodology that I've used, that there's not that much written on those things, and so it becomes a bit more difficult to actually draw out the same kind of level of kind of conclusions. Doesn't mean those things don't work, it just means at the moment we don't really know. So I've got so the paper's available. It's now available on the Careers and Enterprise website. I've linked to it on my blog, so I think our conclusions really were there is actually a strong evidence base. Employer mentoring can have a significant and observable impact on behaviour, attainment and progression. But the effect sizes are quite often quite small, but it's moderate to low cost. It needs to deal with all of these challenges, and it's important that it's high quality and then uses some of the insights that we've drawn from the literature to actually frame how that mentoring programme works. So that's me, and if you're interested, I'll put the slides from this up on my blog and so on. What's happened there? Do that. There we go. Right, yes. So that's
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you both.